Hi, friends. I'm Becca Werwell, author of the Road Trip Rescue series of contemporary faith filled adventures for kids ages 8 to 12. And today I'm here with another behind the scenes video for Road Trip Return, book 2 in the series. And we're going to be talking specifically about the importance of flawed characters in fiction. So, to start, I'll tell you a little bit about the story Road Trip Return. Road Trip Return is the story of 12-year-old Daniel, and Daniel likes life the way it is. It's simple, it's predictable, and just like always, it's just him and his big brother Mateo. But big changes are just around the corner with Mateo getting married to Skylar, and Daniel isn't sure about how to feel. Then, a week before the wedding, Skylar disappears, and they come to discover that it appears that she's gone to Guatemala, which is the home of Daniel's father and the last place in the world he would ever want to go. So Daniel's concerns are confirmed. He is now convinced that Skylar is not right for his brother, she is not right for their family, and that in order to save his family, he must sabotage the search for her at all costs. And so, right there from the book description, you're hearing some things that are a little different, right? Daniel is doing something that we as the reader can think, oh, that's not a good idea, or that's not right. But for him and in his mind, he has justified it to think that it's the right thing to do. And I've had some readers who are like, oh, I'm not sure if we want to see our character making those mistakes or doing those things that might make us feel uncomfortable to read about. But it is part of reality, right? We do make mistakes. We are broken people. And it's in our brokenness that we are able to see God's grace, His mercy, His power to redeem and to transform us. And even as we look to role models in the fiction that we read, even as we look to heroes, we are going to see that they are flawed and that they make mistakes and that they experience consequences for their actions. So, for example, in book 1, Road Trip Rescue, Kimmy can come across as being a little selfish at times. She has this one track mind. Sometimes she's not totally honest. And in the end, we see her transform. We see her transform with her insecurities and the way she sees herself and the way she understands that God created her just as she is. But without those insecurities, without those struggles, that transformation, that healing journey would not be as powerful. Daniel was an interesting character because he ends up looking pretty differently in book 1 and in book 2. So in book 1, Daniel is Kimmy's friend. He comes alongside of her. He seems wise beyond his years in the advice that he offers, but we are not in his head. We are in Kimmy's head. And the reality is, no one looks quite as good inside their head as they often do from the outside, right? We can put on a show from the outside, but often we have things going on inside, maybe thoughts we wish we wouldn't have, but we have emotions that we struggle through. And a lot of times they are not very clear to us. We are struggling to process through our thoughts through what is right and what is wrong and trying to figure out the direction God is leading and where is his voice and what is our voice and what is the outside influence. It can be confusing. So in book 2, we're in Daniel's head and we get to see more of his emotions on the outside and how sometimes he says something, but inside he is struggling, even if that isn't coming through in his words. So it is seeing this character in a whole new way and getting to see a vulnerable new side of him and seeing that he isn't the perfect sidekick, good friend character that he might have seemed like in book 1, because he does bring his own struggles to this story. And so he's a different kind of protagonist because he isn't always working toward good things, but he has convinced himself that he's working toward good things. And I think that's something that a lot of us can relate to. How many times do we try to do the right thing or what we tell ourselves is the right thing, only to discover that it's really not the right thing? And really, it's been more of a matter of us justifying our own actions to try to make ourselves feel better about what we're doing. And those actions actually end up hurting others in the end. They end up hurting ourselves. And we, like Daniel in the story, experience consequences for those things. And again, those flaws, Kimmy's flaws in book 1, Daniel's flaws in book 2, those serve to show us God's redeeming power, showing that character transformation, the journey that they are on. It shows us the goodness of our God in a new way and opens up conversations as we read the story and as we talk about it and as we think about the way God transforms us and works in our lives. Just to go beyond Road Trip Rescue in this series, I want to talk a little bit about some characters from the Bible because the Bible is a great example of how even some of the greatest heroes of the faith that we look up to also sin and also make really bad mistakes that end up affecting them and those around them. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." The brokenness of humanity is part of reality, and that's something I want to reflect in my fiction. Okay, let's get into those Bible character adventures. And there are so many here. There's Adam and Eve, there's Noah, Jacob, King Saul, Jonah. The list goes on and on. I'm going to focus, though, on three stories. I'm going to talk about Moses, King David, and Peter. So let's start with Moses. Moses is a hero in the Old Testament in so many ways. He led the people of Israel out of Egypt. The Bible describes him as being very humble, and he followed God into a lot of hard things, things that were really beyond his comfort zone and that he never would have expected to be called to do. But also, toward the end of his story, he disobeyed God. God told him to speak to the rock for water to come out, and Moses did not obey. And because of it, he wasn't able to enter the land of Canaan. So he did suffer the consequences of his actions. And yet we still look back on his stories and we still see him in many ways as a hero of the faith. King David is my next example. He has a lot of strengths as well. He was willing to fight Goliath. He had the courage to go against a giant when no one else wanted to fight. He had this beautiful friendship that's described with his friend Jonathan, how they cared for each other and supported each other. He wrote so many beautiful worship filled psalms that we still memorize and use today to worship and to praise our God. And he endured under so much hardship when King Saul was after him and being really unfair and trying to kill David. David persevered. But he also had some really big failures. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, and he had her husband Uriah killed. And he suffered the consequences of those actions. And yet we still do look back at David and we still talk about the good stories and the good things he did, right? We can see how God worked in his life. And now, for one more example, I want to talk about Peter from the New Testament. He was one of Jesus' disciples, one of his closest friends. He was the only one who had the courage to step out of the boat and try to walk on water. He acknowledged Jesus as Christ and the Son of God. And then, after Jesus ascended to heaven, Peter had such a big part in growing the early church and in preaching the gospel. And yet, before that, a big failure. The night Jesus was arrested, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus had predicted this, but Peter said, no, never. And yet he did. He denied Jesus. And still, we read these stories of Peter and we see that he was flawed, and yet he had his strengths. We all sin. We all fall short of God's glory. We are all broken. And yet, in our brokenness, we are able to see God's grace and his healing and redeeming power even more than ever. In fact, if we weren't broken, we wouldn't be able to see that transforming power nearly as much. If we weren't broken, how would we see that God has the power to transform? How would we see that God has the power to redeem? So that's, in a nutshell, a little bit about why in Road Trip Return I felt strong about having Daniel make big mistakes, having him learn from those mistakes, having him struggle through some challenging emotions that, on some level, I do think we can all relate to. Road Trip Return is available on Kickstarter to order early copies from April 16th to May 2nd. You can check that out at Kickstarter.com. Just search for Road Trip Return. If you are listening to this before April 16th, you can follow the pre-launch page. If you are listening to this after May 2nd, you can stay tuned, sign up for my email list to be notified once the book is available on retailers later this year. And in the meantime, happy reading. I'll talk to you later.